Hey, great to see you. Can you hear me back there in the cheap seats? Yeah? Okay. All right. We're watching right now as our country is basically is in the middle of a fascist takeover. There's no other way to describe it beyond that. It's becoming more and more obvious every day. We have students being snatched off the streets and transported to brutal prisons. We have people being, with no due process whatsoever, being transported to foreign countries. This is the kind of stuff that you expect to see in Russia or even in old Nazi Germany or in modern day. Actually, even Hungary isn't quite this bad. I don't know if you caught this a couple days ago. Donald Trump signed I believe it was Thursday, signed an executive order saying that if you are a woman who changed her name because you were married and you try to register to vote for the next election, and the name on your birth certificate is not the same as the name on your passport, and you never went to a court of law to legally change your name, you may not vote. They're getting ready for the 2026 election, the 2028 election. If the courts strike down that executive order, which they probably will, there's a bill in Congress called the SAVE Act that the Republicans are about to pass through the House and probably will pass the Senate and get signed by the president that says the same thing. This could disenfranchise 70 million American women. Of course, women vote about 7 points more than men do for Democrats. So the reason for this is fairly obvious. This is a regime that is absolutely focused, now that they have this power, on never losing it, on absolutely concentrating it, seizing it, and making sure that they are never out of power. Never. When Trump during the campaign last year said, "Vote for me and you'll never have to vote again," he was not being facetious. So how did we get here? I can identify dozens of different starting points, some that go back to the founding of the Republic. But the one that I think is most relevant to this moment was in 1976. In 1976, William F. Buckley, the guy who who published the National Review, who famously published an article back in the 70s, I believe it was, arguing that white people should run America because they're genetically superior to black people. His brother was running for the United States Senate. The Buckley family is very wealthy, or was. They're both passed away now. And his brother wanted to fund his own campaign, but the campaign finance laws said you couldn't do that. There were campaign limits, campaign finance limits in the 70s, in 76. By and large, many of them go back to 1907 and even before that. And I'll get to that in just a second. But the specific one that he was objecting to was passed in the 1974, I believe, in response to the Nixon bribery scandals and everything that was going on there, that limited campaign donations to $2,000 or $3,000 per person. So he sued and took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And a group of Republicans on the Supreme Court decided, for the first time in American history, out of thin air, you will not find this anywhere in the Constitution, that when somebody spends money on a political campaign, they're buying advertising, that advertising is putting their voice on the air, therefore that money is a proxy for their voice, therefore that money is protected by the First Amendment as free speech. And this decision was called Buckley versus Vallejo, and Buckley being the senator, and that was the first chink in the wall. Now, it didn't just blow the doors open to everybody's money, it just let rich people finance their own elections. At that point in time, more than half of the people in the House of Representatives and about a third of the senators were average working class, middle class people. There were actually an awful lot of veterans from World War II who were in Congress at that time. That certainly is not the case today. There's a tiny handful of people in Congress now who are not multimillionaires. So that was followed 2 years later by a far more egregious Supreme Court decision, First National Bank versus Bellotti. There was a law in Massachusetts that said that if you were a corporation, you could not give money to political campaigns unless they directly affected your business. And the First National Bank of Boston decided that they wanted to help fund a campaign around a politician who was supporting the end of abortion in the United States. This was right after Roe v. Wade, just 5 years after Roe v. Wade. And so they contributed money to this. So the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Frank Bellotti, sued them. Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti went to the Supreme Court. The bank sued all the way to the Supreme Court in response to Bellotti. And 5 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court, a decision that was written by Lewis Powell, who in 1971 had written a memo to Eugene Sindor, his friend and neighbor, who was the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, saying that, we need to take over the media, we need to take over the universities, we need to take over Congress, we need to, the so-called Powell memo. Lewis Powell actually wrote this decision. Nixon put him on the Supreme Court in '72. And that decision said that not only is money speech, but corporations are also persons. Now, this had been intimated back in 1886 in a case that I actually wrote a book about called Unequal Protection, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. But in fact, the court never decided that. They never ruled that. It was simply put into the head note by the clerk of the court, which is kind of I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It's kind of a side story. But with the Bellotti case, the Supreme Court said this is absolutely the case. Corporations have rights under the Bill of Rights. And over the next decade or so, we saw a couple of things happen. First off, Ronald Reagan washed into the White House on a tsunami of oil industry money in 1980, 2 years later. The Supreme Court ruled that, I believe it was DuPont, it was one of the big chemical companies, they had been illegally emitting benzene, and they'd been doing it through the roof, thinking that they were getting really slick, nobody would catch them. And so the EPA flew an airplane over their roof with a benzene sensor and busted them. They sued. The Supreme Court said, oh no, you can't do that, EPA. DuPont has, or whatever the company was, has Fourth Amendment rights of privacy because they're a person. Corporations were no longer being forced to testify about their own crimes in court because they had Fifth Amendment protections against self-incrimination. Corporations could now, advertise, they could throw money at politicians, all these sort of things. So this then began the really serious money corruption of politics in the United States, these 2 decisions and the Reagan Revolution. From there, we pass forward to 2010, Citizens United, and the Supreme Court ruled that it's not just rich people who can throw money into campaigns. In fact, we're going to blow up virtually all campaign limits by creating super PACs. There are still campaign limits. You can only give a certain amount of money to an individual candidate, but you can give $1 billion to their super PAC. Just ask Elon Musk. So now we have this situation where Elon Musk is going to Wisconsin tomorrow, or maybe it's today, and he's going to pass out checks for $1 million each to people who are, committing to voting for the right guy or something to that effect. I mean, he's not quite that blatant, although Ben Wickler, our buddy who's the head of the Wisconsin Democrats, is suing, saying, wait a minute, it's against the Wisconsin law to do this. Now, it wasn't always this way. In fact, it wasn't always this way that the Supreme Court had the power to say these kinds of things. Back when the Supreme Court was literally being created, when the Constitution had been written in 1787, and they were selling the thing, it was ratified in 1789. In 1787 and 88, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote a series of papers called the Federalist Papers as a sales pitch for the Constitution. And Hamilton writes in Federalist 81, he says, in the first place, there is, because people were concerned about the Supreme Court having too much power, he said, in the first place, there's not a syllable in the plan under consideration, the Constitution, which directly empowers the national courts to construe the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution, or which gives them greater latitude in this respect than may be claimed by the courts of any state. So here's Hamilton saying, no, Supreme Court can't do that, don't worry. And in fact, the Supreme Court is subordinate to Congress. This is Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which is our law right now. The Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, in other words, it's the final court of appeals, both as to law and effect, with such exceptions, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. So, sounded good, you know. We're going to have the courts as the final court of appeals. Congress has some control over this. Yes, we can have voices if things are completely out of control. I'm not completely opposed to judicial review, and neither, frankly, was Hamilton. In fact, in other places in Federalist 81, he argued for judicial review. But in 1803, the Supreme Court, in a decision called Marbury versus Madison, without the whole long background description, ruled that they could strike down laws that had been passed by Congress, which was kind of the beginning of this process. And it wasn't entirely unreasonable, but Thomas Jefferson, who was president in 1803, went absolutely nuts. He wrote a letter to his old friend, Judge Spencer Roane, the son-in-law of Patrick Henry. He said, "If this opinion be sound, then indeed is our Constitution a complete felo de se," which is Latin for suicide pact, "for intending to establish 3 departments, coordinate and independent, that they might check and balance one another, given, according to this opinion, to one of them alone the right to prescribe for the government of the others, and that too which is unelected by the nation." He said, "The Constitution on this hypothesis is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which may twist or shape it in any form they please. My construction of the Constitution is very different from that you quote. Each department is truly independent of the others and has an equal right for itself. What is the meaning of the Constitution? A judiciary independent of a king or executive alone is a good thing, but independent of the will of the nation is a solecism, a blunder, at least in a republican government." But it stood. It stood. But there was such a blowback in 1803 to this that the next time the Supreme Court actually, ruled based on the Constitution was long after Jefferson was dead. It was 1856, and the decision was Dred Scott, which ruled that all across America, including the North, black people could be claimed as property by white people, that they had no rights of citizenship. If ever there was an example of the insanity of this decision, which led us straight to the Civil War. So, really, from that period of time up until arguably the 1940s, 1950s, very rarely did the Supreme Court strike down laws based on the Constitution. Very rarely did they create things out of whole cloth saying they were doing it on the Constitution. But they really started doing this aggressively after the Reagan Revolution. Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court Justice, was one of the real leaders of this. And this is what led us to this series of decisions in 1976, 78, 2010, and then McCutcheon in 2013 that said that, unlimited money, no problem. They said that they found this in the Constitution. There is literally not one single word in the Constitution that says this. I mean, the simple reality is that there's a whole long list of things that most Americans want. Solidifying Social Security, expanding Medicare and Medicaid, building good, high-quality public schools, free college education for everybody, a national health care system that works. All of these things poll 70, 80%, and yet we don't have them. Why don't we have them? Because of big money. Why does big money have that kind of power? Because of these Supreme Court decisions. Now, the one caveat to all this, the one thing, the saving grace here, the one thing that could conceivably pull us out of it, and by the way, this is how Trump got into office, right? A billionaire drops roughly, a little short of $300 million into a campaign at the last minute and starts passing out $1 million checks in Pennsylvania, and suddenly you've got Donald Trump as president. This is the deadly to democracy. And frankly, to human beings. I mean, killing USAID is going to kill millions of people. Killing off our public health system is going to kill thousands of Americans. This is the deadly consequence of this doctrine, these twin doctrines, that corporations are persons and money is speech. that were literally invented out of whole cloth in the 70s and amplified in 2010 by 5 corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court who themselves had been taking money from billionaires. So what do we do about this? Legislation was passed in 2022, as I recall, in the second year of the Biden administration. Yeah, that would have been 2022. It was called the For the People Act. It was H.R. 1. It was the first piece of legislation that Nancy Pelosi put forward that would have essentially gutted the Citizens United decision. It would have used Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution that says the Congress can create exceptions to the things that the Supreme Court can rule on. Congress can overrule the Supreme Court. And it would have restored campaign finance limits. It passed the House of Representatives. It passed the Senate, or it didn't pass the Senate, it got 51 votes in the Senate. And then it was, of course, filibustered by Republicans. Republicans reached out to Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, 2 Democrats, said, hey, be on our side, okay? And, both, Manchin, of course, is a coal baron, and Sinema is now very, very wealthy. She started out as a green, and they refused to go along with the filibuster, and so that got killed. And that, again, is the reason, I would say largely the reason why Donald Trump is president right now. So, bottom line, Abraham Lincoln once famously said, public opinion is everything. You can't do anything, ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't do anything against public opinion. Republicans are never going to reverse Citizens United. This is not going to happen. And I don't mean this as some kind of a partisan pitch. I'm not here as a partisan pitch man for the Democratic Party. I got a lot of problems with the Democratic Party. But the simple reality is that the Democrats damn near got this thing passed, and I can tell you right now, given everything that's happened in the last couple of years, if they get in power again, they will. There's no doubt about that. And it would restore democracy to America. So we need to take Abraham Lincoln's advice. This weekend, there are protests literally all around the world against Tesla. On April 5th, next Saturday, there are going to be protests in every city in the country. We need to show up. We need to stand up. We need to speak out. We need to get on social media and absolutely raise hell, even though the algorithms are against us. Right? Social media owned by billionaires also, because we're not enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act anymore. I mean, it's the insanity that we are facing as a consequence of these 4 decisions by 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court in every case is absolutely overwhelming, and we've got to defeat it. So please, get active. Thank you so much.